morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started right at 10, even though I know a few people will be joining us here over the next few minutes. Thank you for attending our September webinar. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. This presentation today is being recorded. As such, we ask that you keep your sound muted throughout unless otherwise asked by the presenter. Throughout the presentation, you are welcome to add your questions through the chat function, which will be monitored and then asked during designated Q&A portions of today's presentation. This webinar is 2 CEUs, and there are strict guidelines on how participants are approved for virtual CE credit. At the end of today's program, I will announce a verification code. Please write down this code and save it. Following the webinar, we will email a survey where you will be asked to enter this verification code. Per APA guidelines, completion of this survey is required by the deadline of October 9th. No credit will be given if the survey is not completed by that stated deadline. And with that, we will get started with our presentation addressing religious trauma in therapy with queer, trans, and BIPOC, QTBIPOC clients. A quick introduction of our speaker, Dr. Valerie Yo earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Denver and completed a postdoctorate fellowship at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. She has worked in many settings, including universities, community mental health centers, and residential facilities. She currently works in private practice, providing individual therapy and immigration-based assessments to adults and with psychology and counseling trainees in supervision and teaching roles. She also works at Oregon Health and Science University in the Reproductive Psychiatry and OBGYN department. Dr. Yo believes strongly in fostering connection between all parts of ourselves. Her work is centered around navigating the ways in which our socio-political environments impact our internal experiences. So with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Yo this morning.
Thanks so much, Taylor. And it's really nice. I can't see everyone, but it's really nice knowing that you are all here virtually. And I just wanted to start with a little welcome. And just as a note today, for accessibility purposes, I am going to be verbally describing each slide as well as reading all the text on the slide. And so this is a welcome slide. The title reads welcome. And then please share in the chat your name, your pronouns, and then what is your least favorite fruit. And I recently attended a workshop where this was the icebreaker, and honestly, I thought it was just a hilarious icebreaker, and so I'm using it here. And so my name is Valerie, and I use she and they pronouns. My least favorite fruit is papaya because I do think it smells like vomit, and I will be taking no questions about that at this time. And feel free to go ahead and share your least favorite fruit in the chat as we get started. And this slide is on a beige background, and there are dark green and pink brushstroke shapes in the corners. And as you do that, I'm just going to quickly go over our agenda for today. We have a lot to cover today. I have run this training quite a few times, and each time I do change it a little bit. And so just one note, the slides that I sent out are a slightly different version of the slides that I'm going to be presenting today. They're like 97% the same, but I will send the updated slides to Taylor at the end of this, and then she will send them out to you after all this. But for the most part, all the slides are the same. I just switched around some of the order and added one new slide. And so this slide, the title is the agenda. And each bullet point is a topic that we're going to be covering today. So we are going to go through the welcome. And after this, I'm going to go over some workshop guidelines. We'll move through a brief grounding and check-in about the topic. And then I am going to talk a little bit about religious trauma and adverse religious experiences and the difference between the two. And then we're going to move into religious power and control and the cycle of abuse, and then the manifestations of religious trauma, and then religious deconstruction. And then we are going to pause for a quick check-in and discussion before we move into a short break. And then when we come back from the break, we're going to talk through just the topic of purity culture and shame and how those two things can be intertwined, the impact of internalized oppression on religious trauma, integrating a liberation psychology lens into working with clients around religious trauma, and then moving into a final discussion and check-in, and then a closing at the end. And this slide is on a beige background, and there is some orange and tan rectangle art on the right. And then this slide, the title is called Workshop Guidelines, and each bullet point goes over just guidelines that I like to just have present for any training that I'm running. And so I encourage as much as possible for all of you to be present as much as you can and listen intentionally. Please do keep yourself on mute if you're not speaking. If it does feel safe and accessible to you, please keep your cameras on, but also, I know that with a lot of these Zoom trainings, sometimes it's not accessible for you to do that. So please go ahead and do whatever makes the most sense for you to take care of yourselves today. In any discussion, please show respect to each other and acknowledge that our collective wisdom and knowledge are greater than any individual knowledge. Embrace curiosity. Do everything possible to create a safe, non-judgmental, and supportive environment for others in the space, especially during Q&A times. And then above all, also practice self-care during this time. I know this can be a pretty big topic. And this slide is on a beige background with some dark green, orange, and pink shapes around the corners. Okay, and then before we move into a lot of the content, I wanted to do just some brief grounding and check-in and some reflection questions, and you can feel free to share in the chat. And the reflection questions are, what drew you to take this course on religious trauma? What does the idea of religious trauma evoke for you? And where do you see yourself headed in terms of this type of work? And feel free to go ahead and share some things in the chat. And this slide is on a beige background, again, with dark green and pink paint shapes around the corners. And as you're sharing, I just want to do a little disclaimer that religious trauma is a really big topic, especially right now, I think, with all the sociopolitical events that are happening all around us. I think it does feel especially salient to me in this moment, and especially in terms of integrating liberation work into addressing religious trauma. This can feel like a pretty heavy topic. And so today, what I'm going to go over is a pretty broad overview. It might be hard to absorb some of this information, and some of this information may even feel somewhat activating to learn about if you yourself have your own history of religious trauma. And a little background about myself, I did not grow up in church in my younger childhood years, but I got pretty heavily involved in evangelical Christian spaces in high school and also attended a Christian college. And I identified as Christian for some years after that. And while I no longer identify that way and have not been involved in church spaces for a long time, these experiences still impact my life. And these experiences are a big part of why I'm running this workshop today. And if you're attending this workshop today, I imagine some of you may have similar backgrounds or, are at least working with people in your practices who may have similar backgrounds. So all this said, I encourage you to take care of yourselves over the next couple of hours and also after this workshop. And just as another note, today's content is going to be primarily focused on religious trauma within a Christian context. And some of this content may be more broadly applied to religious trauma in other religious settings, but just as a disclaimer, this workshop is going to be focused largely on trauma within the realm of Christianity. I wanted to make that clear. And then if I can ask you to share one more thing in the chat. This next slide, the title just reads religious trauma, and then it reads, what do you know about religious trauma? And you can draw from experiences that you've heard about or from your own experiences if you feel comfortable sharing. And feel free to type in the chat and just be mindful of any graphic details and avoid content that might feel activating to others who are attending. Give you a little moment to do that. And this slide is again on a beige background, and there's a dark green oval shape on the right. I'm just going ahead and reading a lot of your responses. Okay, so a pretty wide breadth of experiences. Some folks who have their own experiences, some folks who are working with people who have a lot of these experiences. Thank you for sharing. And as you go ahead and continue to do that, I'm going to move to the next slide. And this slide is again on a beige background. There's a dark green oval shape on the right, and the title is examples. And then there are 3 examples of religious trauma, especially with queer, trans, and BIPOC community that I'm gonna go ahead and read. So the first example is a BIPOC church attendee is the only white person attending a service. Although the other white attendees outwardly behave in a friendly way toward them, they've also seen many of these church members express support for racist social and political policies over social media. The second example is a person with a history of sexual abuse who previously went through an abortion sits in a prayer service where multiple people pray out loud, comparing abortion to genocide. When this person confides in their male, straight, cisgender pastor about their history of abuse and discomfort with the prayers, the pastor tells them to, quote, repent. And then the final example is a queer church attendee attends a sermon where the pastor talks for an hour about marriage as being between, quote, a man and a woman, and denounces the queer and trans community for, quote, forcing their values on the rest of their community. And so these examples, they're all real examples. They're all examples that I actually drew from an amalgamation of things that my clients have shared with me and unfortunately are more common than not. And so when we're working with clients around this topic, these are the types of examples that we might consider as people are moving through their own experiences of religious trauma. And then moving on to the next slide, this slide is again on a beige background, and there is again the dark green oval shape on the right, and the title is definitions. And I'm just going to go through and read the definitions, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about them. So the first definition is religious and spiritual abuse. And this is abuse that happens under the pretext of religion. It doesn't really differ significantly from other types of abusive relationships other than having the religious pretext to it. The second definition is adverse religious experiences. And this is any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy and or negatively impacts their physical, social, and emotional, relational, or psychological well-being. And then the third definition is religious trauma. And this is the physical, emotional, or psychological response to religious abuse or adverse religious experiences. And these can include religious beliefs, practices, or structures that overwhelm an individual's ability to cope and return to a sense of safety. And so one important thing to note, and this is the last note on this slide, is that adverse religious experiences or religious abuse do not automatically equate to or lead to religious trauma. And also another thing to note is that there are no universal terms. The terms religious abuse and spiritual abuse are often used pretty interchangeably. And when I'm working with folks around this idea of religious abuse, one thing I like to note too is that religious abuse often doesn't really require any intentional malice or intentional harm. And in many cases, religious abuse specifically can be an extension of what someone has been taught is kind of a normal or acceptable way to treat other people. And so for many who have left high control religions, and I'm going to talk a little bit on the next slide about what a high control religion is and some of the signs to look out for with high control religions. So for many who have left high control spaces, much of what may now be considered abusive or harmful to them may have first been taught to them as something even like a spiritual practice or even a discipline that's seen within the religious system as pretty essential for living a godly or a spiritual life. And then the other thing to note is that religious trauma is also it's still a growing and somewhat new area of study. And anytime I run, this workshop, I do another literature review, and there is very little literature out there about religious trauma, specifically in QTBIPOC communities. And then the other thing to note too, and right before the first break, I'm going to talk a little bit about the deconstruction movement, and this is essentially the movement toward deconversion. And this is a movement that for a lot of people who are leaving religious spaces, it's a movement for people who are essentially kind of deconstructing their belief system. But this deconstruction movement, the movement kind of as a social movement, it's a largely white, very liberal, very intellectualized movement, which I think can be really helpful for working with clients around their inner lives. But this work tends not to overlap a lot into things like community care or community interventions. And as a result, sometimes it can feel kind of exclusionary to people who have lost their communities as a result of leaving their religious or spiritual communities. So I think deconstruction can give people a lot of tools on how to deconstruct cognitively, but not so much, tools on how to reconstruct their lives. And this can lead to a lot of issues on an emotional and relational level. And then also, religious abuse doesn't necessarily differ a lot from other types of abusive relationships, such as domestic violence, for instance. But the difference between religious abuse and other types of abuse is the messaging behind it and the power and control dynamics, which have, I think, some unique factors that are worth being explored and understood to work with clients who are experiencing religious trauma. And so religious abuse can include things like solicitation for money, withholding medical treatment, theological bullying, which is kind of interpreting scripture or holy works in some way that invalidates or oppresses someone's identity or someone's community. Religious abuse can often be used as a justification for things like domestic violence and abuse. And then sometimes it does also include physical and sexual abuse perpetrated by a member of the clergy. And I do think there is a disproportionate amount of the religious trauma literature currently being focused on sexual abuse perpetrated by clergy, and with the particular emphasis on the sexual abuse that has happened in the Catholic Church. And I think this is a really important area of study. But one thing it doesn't acknowledge is that perpetrators of abuse can be found in every denomination, not just the Catholic Church. And although sexual abuse by clergy is most certainly a form of religious abuse, there are also many other categories and types of religious abuse, such as marginalization and othering of queer and trans communities, BIPOC communities, people who identify as women. And then also as a note, some may find it helpful to differentiate between religious harm, adverse religious experiences, and religious abuse, as opposed to religious trauma more broadly. And then I'm going to move on to the next slide. And this slide is again on a beige background. There's again the dark green oval shape on the right. And the title of this slide is Stephen Hassan's BITE model. And so Stephen Hassan is a cult expert, and he has determined a method of determining whether a group may be considered high control or authoritarian, and it's called the BITE model. So BITE stands for each one corresponds to a different form of control. And then each of the bullet points on this slide corresponds to one of those. So the first is behavior control, and then information control, thought control, and emotion control. And so behavior control is essentially when a church or a religious community discourages individuality in any form and starts to promote group conformity through certain behaviors. So there can be a pretty broad spectrum of extremity here, but some common controlled behaviors might include controlling members of the community in terms of what they can wear, what food they can eat, what entertainment they consume, or even sexual experiences. And so it's a way of regulating someone's physical reality as a way of dictating, how and with whom they can live, how they can, who they can associate with. And as a result, it can keep people pretty isolated. And so we do see this a lot, in cults where people are easier to control if they're a little bit more isolated. And then the second one is information control. And this is when church or religious community starts to dictate what information members can receive from the outside world. So this could include things like restricting access to the internet or other forms of communication, or pushing things like propaganda, or pushing group approved resources only, and really regulating how people can kind of gather new information or glean new information from the outside. And then thought control is a little bit more complicated, and there is like a bit more sinister aspect to authoritarian religions who integrate thought control. But this is essentially where the group mentality gets into an individual's thought life until they have some trouble separating their own thinking and desires from those of the group. And frequently this happens by encouraging a lot of black and white thinking, all or nothing thinking, kind of an us versus them mentality, and discouraging critical thinking, and kind of assigning one person or very few people the ability to disseminate information or to be experts within the group. And then finally, there's emotion control. And this happens in high control churches when some emotions are essentially, they're labeled bad, such as the emotions like doubt or anger, for example, might be labeled bad emotions. while other emotions might be prioritized, such as even fear or guilt being labeled as, good emotions that might help keep you in line or keep you kind of in the fold. And so someone might experience a cycle of emotional abuse in which sometimes they receive love and sometimes they're punished, sometimes for the same behaviors, which does keep things pretty confusing and then keeps people under the control of the group. So all these things together, especially when they're all together specifically, can be just some red flags to look out for when sites are telling us about potential high control religious spaces. And then moving on to the next slide, and this is again on a beige background with the dark green oval shape on the right. And this slide is titled Religious Power and Control. And so the first bullet reads, power and control is a dynamic, and many abusive systems can be built on this foundation. And a lot of times with places that do kind of integrate more high control elements to their religions, especially within the context of religious and spiritual spaces, there can be kind of a patriarchal, fundamentalist, sometimes white supremacist, frequently abusive system that is built on power and control. And this can sometimes be a little bit difficult to recognize, which this second bullet point reads, this can be difficult to recognize because any individual behavior by itself might not be seen as intrinsically harmful. So it's only when these behaviors start to add up that it can start to feel like something is wrong. And so a lot of us here have probably seen the power and control wheel as it relates to domestic violence. And so the Religious Trauma Institute, which I have a resource page at the end of this training, but the Religious Trauma Institute is an institute focusing on the treatment of religious trauma. They've created their own religious power and control wheel, kind of based off of the power and control wheel that most of us have seen for working with domestic violence. And I kind of view this as a starting point. It's a non-exhaustive list. But just like the other power and control wheel, the religious power and control wheel speaks to a lot of different categories of power and control. And so the next few bullet points do go down the list, and I'm just going to read them off for now. And so the first one is the loss of autonomy, then isolation, then minimizing, denying, and blaming, then emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, threats, accusations, and intimidation, economic control, and sexuality and gender defining. And so what this wheel gets at in essence is that these systems are kind of designed in a way to require people to change, maybe even to the point of forgetting who they are in order to be a part of the system and in order to be included in the system. And I think in religion and religious spaces, this type of systemic control can feel very unique, as it's not uncommon to hear religious leaders claiming to speak on behalf of a higher power, such as God, or claiming that the higher power is infallible and has all the answers and that they are the only ones who can interpret these answers. And so it kind of keeps people very much in line and keeps them kind of under their thumb. And then, unsurprisingly, for people who are very immersed in this system, it can result in just some difficulty knowing how to trust oneself, knowing how to trust our own senses. And there can also be a very strong us versus them mentality where people outside the system are viewed as dangerous. And this might be solidified by things like threats of punishment if someone within the system gets too close to someone on the outside. So in terms of the loss of autonomy, this could look like shutting down of our own intuition, of our own thoughts and opinions in order to align more closely with the group. And then this leads to an inability to trust oneself, maybe needing external authority for permission to do certain things, having, all of our time, energy, and resources spent on religious activities, and very little time allotted to any other activities outside of the religious community. And then, not surprisingly, with isolation, kind of, if this kind of system is meant to cut off relationships with people who are kind of outside the religious system. So going back to that information control piece, in certain communities, people might be required to report back on how they spent their time, where they've spent their money. There might be an increased level of commitment to the system's activities, and then a devaluing of people or activities who are outside of the system. In terms of minimizing, denying, and blaming, when abuse does happen, frequently leaders will deny that the abuse happened, or even deny the severity of what happened, a lot of victim blaming, or even requiring forgiveness when, even if they did acknowledge that the abuse happened. So there's a lot of difficulty taking ownership as a result of how someone else's actions might have impacted you. There's this kind of minimizing of our felt senses, of our emotions, of our experiences in order to survive kind of being in this type of group where there is so much abuse that could be happening. In terms of emotional abuse, in certain communities, especially high control communities, there can be things like name calling, requiring someone to suppress a part of themselves, like their sexuality or their gender identity, for example, resulting again in an inability to trust oneself. I worked recently with a client who exited a cult a few years ago and told me that like when people would try to leave the cult, they would have people who were designated as quote catchers, and the people leaving were designated as bunnies. So you would have like bunnies and catchers, and people whose job essentially was to like go after the people who were left and kind of bring them back in and fold them back into the group. And then also, you know, what we talked about on the previous slide, spiritual abuse can also be things like being required to submit to spiritual authorities like pastors or a church board or some sort of religious leader, very little accountability for clergy or for leadership, and decisions being made on your behalf and being told that they're for your own good. In more extreme situations, there might be threats or accusations or intimidation. So this might look like things like threatening abandonment of the person who is having some doubts about the religious community, or even threatening excommunication, which is getting kicked out of the religious community for either sinning or for going outside a group in some way. And then going back to that behavior control piece that can be a lot of times integrated into this piece around threats and accusations. In certain communities, there might also be some economic control, such as requiring a portion of your paycheck to go toward the church or the religious community. There might be a lot of expectation of unpaid volunteer hours at the expense of other commitments. Sometimes in certain communities, there's a devaluation of education and a lot of guilt tripping over needing to give more money or time to the religious community, and then being told that God should meet all your needs while they're also draining you of your own resources. And then finally, with sexuality and gender defining, in some high control communities, there can be the sense of defining really rigid gender roles and teaching the inherent sinfulness of certain specific sexual expressions. This is very based in the gender binary, and sometimes a belief that one gender is greater than the other. So policing sexual expressions, really reinforcing patriarchal values in these sorts of communities as a means of keeping people controlled. And so I will say, in terms of addressing systemic and institutional abuses, the Religious Trauma Institute within the realm of this wheel lists only patriarchal privilege. And I would personally also add white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism to this list. And just as a note, the wheel, if you are going to distribute to clients, the wheel does list police as a resource multiple times. And depending on your client and their identity, that might not always be the most helpful resource for them. And so just one thing to note, especially if you're working with clients of color. And then the next slide is essentially just a visual representation of the wheel. It's again on a beige background. And so it's the power and control wheel visual shaped like a pie with a lot of text inside each slide. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but this is something that you can find online too. If you just Google religious power and control wheel, you can get a PDF of it. But this is just something that, you know, I think it can for me and for certain clients be a pretty helpful visualization of the ways that all these things can come together. And then moving on to the next slide, the title of this slide is Religious Cycle of Abuse. And it's again on a beige background with a dark green oval shape on the right. And the first few bullet points essentially list the each part of the religious cycle of abuse. So the first one being love bombing, then the tension building phase, then the explosion phase, then the honeymoon phase. And I'm going to go through each one individually. And so when we're talking about high control religions, what we're talking, not every religion is a high control religion. There are certain religious and faith communities that I think are very pro-social and create, a sense of community and sharing of resources for clients. So those are not really the types of religious communities that we're addressing today. So when we're talking about religious trauma today, I'm talking more about these high control environments, which is essentially a faith community that requires obedience and discourages members from questioning its rules or its principles or its practices. So these are religious communities that expect subservience and discourage trusting relationships with people who are outside the group. And so the first part of the religious cycle of abuse, which again kind of can mirror the domestic violence cycle of abuse, is usually this love bombing phase. And within the context of high control religious environments, it frequently begins with this phase. And this is a period of time where when someone first enters into these communities, the system shows a really intense display of affection. And this could include a lot of compliments, maybe even gifts. There's a lot of connection seeking and demonstrating a complete understanding of who you are. And I think for a lot of people who, are seeking out religious communities, people are looking for belonging, people are looking for connection and understanding and a sense of group camaraderie, and they get this in spades at the beginning. And during this first phase, they might be shown a pretty romanticized view of God or Jesus, or maybe even other savior figures. They might be told stories of how other group members were saved and found purpose and how good their life is now that they're a part of the group. And so, as you can imagine, there's usually a big rush of emotions during this initial phase of conversion, where someone might feel lighter, they might feel more connected from tapping into a source that feels greater than themselves. And then they might also feel really celebrated by the other people in this group. And so the person who is newly entered into the system is given a lot of grace, a lot of patience, a lot of attention as they kind of begin their new life. And this phase is really important because this is the phase that people will frequently look back on when things start to get a little bit tough. And then after this phase, it frequently will move into a tension building phase. And this starts when the love bombing starts to wane, where people might start to experience a greater pressure to conform to group standards. The patience and grace that they experience might begin to dwindle. And this is the section where the group might start to isolate the person, maybe starting to warn them that the outside world is a dangerous place. And people might start to feel shame that they're not getting it, or maybe even start to feel like they can't accept the answers that are being given to them. But during this phase, usually any attempts to reason with group members get squashed, and the person may even be accused of things like unfaithfulness or leading others to doubt their own faith. And then this might cause even greater shame in a spiral. And then the person starts to become more compliant as they seek to prove that they're worthy of the group. And then the different phases of this cycle of abuse are often repeated and with greater frequency and intensity the more the cycle goes around, not unlike the domestic violence cycle of abuse. And so this above description of, the love bombing and detention building phase may align best with someone's first experience of the tension building phase, but subsequent tension building periods can also arise after honeymoon periods, after the cycle goes around again. And when the tension building phase builds to a certain point, sometimes it might result in an explosion phase. So in a DV relationship, this phase may include physical or sexual violence or other types of dangerous behavior. In high control religious environments, this type of behavior is somewhat less common, although they can still occur and have occurred in certain cases. But this explosion phase is usually more in the realm of the emotion and kind of cognitive and thought control aspect, where it usually comes on the heels of the tension building phase, to the point where the person in question must be essentially reined in at all costs by the system, and in some cases excommunicated or kind of booted from the church or the system. And in certain church settings, this phase sometimes occurs in a really public setting, like a membership meeting, where people's behaviors are publicly discussed, and sometimes consequences or even punishments get to be voted on by the group at large. And then this phase may include threats or active steps to remove the person from the group or cut them out of the group. And then the threat often coincides with warnings that the person who's being accused will no longer be under the protection of the church and might be at the mercy of the outside world or even the devil. And then sometimes this faith also occurs in private settings, and that in some extreme cases can also involve things like harassment or isolation from other people. And then the last phase is the honeymoon phase, where it may seem odd that a honeymoon phase comes on the heels of the explosion, but frequently the really high emotion and intensity of the explosion phase will cause people to kind of prioritize reconciliation. And many people, after an explosion, are really eager to do anything it takes to return to a safer status quo, especially if their entire community and then their entire lives are wrapped up in this religious or spiritual community. So during this phase, apologies or promises might be made. Some of their concerns may even be addressed, with some promises of reconnection and restoring relationships. And individuals who are in this system are usually already pretty conditioned to believe that they're inherently sinful or that there's something inherently wrong or bad about them, and that they need religious leaders to guide them. And so, people in this phase can sometimes be pretty willing to go along with whatever restoration plan church leaders have created for them. And so you might ask, like, what keeps people in this cycle? And just like other cycles of abuse, depending on folks, who are indoctrinated into this sort of religious environment, a lot of times people have been raised in this environment where they've never um, really, seen an environment or been in a community outside of this environment. And so being indoctrinated into a really specific way of living, especially if it's been from your childhood, can make leaving feel nearly impossible. Sometimes, if people's communities are really tied up in these spiritual communities, there might be even kind of a pragmatic inability to provide for oneself. Like some people, and especially if a lot of their education and their training has been wrapped up in these religious communities, they may not have the education or career skills outside of ministry to make it financially possible to leave or to support their families if they did leave. And a lot of times people's hopes and dreams are tied up with this sort of their sense of spirituality and the way that they are connected with their community over their spirituality. People believing that if they could submit more or repent more or sin less, then life might go back to the way it was during the love bombing phase. And often these types of communities have fostered a lot of fear of life outside the system, that a lot of people in these sort of high control spaces may have been isolated and taught about the dangers and evils of the world outside the system. And then on the flip side, I think there can also be this sense of fear about society's view of religion, that if someone is in a community where religion is viewed pretty positively, they may fear that people won't take their trauma experiences seriously. Or on the other hand, if religion is viewed pretty negatively in certain spaces, people may fear that others will judge them for the decisions that they've made and the time that they've spent in the religion, or the past few years of their lives. And all these things can really serve to keep people stuck. And so these phases, at the last bullet point on this slide reads, these phases may be experienced both by individuals who are born into high control religious environments or who enter later in life. And a lot of times this cycle can kind of spin around in similar ways, just depending on the way that someone interacts with their community. And then on the next slide, because we are focusing more on religious trauma within more of a Christian context today, the title of this slide is Core Beliefs and Teaching. And then it says it's also this is a non-exhaustive list. But in terms of when we are thinking about evangelical Christianity, more specifically, this list has some beliefs and teachings that are more specific to evangelical Christianity, especially high control religious environments that integrate with evangelical Christianity. And this slide is again on a beige background. There is the dark green oval shape on the right. So the first bullet point is the quote, born again experience. And this is essentially the experience of religious conversion. And when we're talking about high control religious spaces within the context of evangelical Christianity, this is a pretty key part of religious belief, where essentially people are born sinful and then they get saved through the conversion process. So usually praying a certain or specific prayer to God or to a certain deity. And it's this conversion process that differentiates Christians from non-Christians. It's usually a very emotional experience, with a lot of grief and sorrow about your previous life, followed by belief and receiving forgiveness from God and receiving kind of connection from the community. And so the second bullet point reads, you are saved by someone else. So essentially, you cannot save yourself, that there's something inherently wrong with you, and you require someone like God or your community to save you. The third bullet point is the teaching around original sin, which is essentially this idea that you're born bad, only God can save you. And this kind of fear of going outside the lines can really keep people in religion out of fear and shame. And as a result, we kind of lose our ability to sort through our own thoughts and feelings about some of the behaviors that might be within the community because we have been told that there's something kind of inherently wrong with us. The fourth bullet point is the Bible. So in evangelical Christianity, more specifically, the Bible is essentially the primary moral authority. In certain evangelical communities, not all of them, but in certain communities, the Bible is seen as kind of the direct word of God, that it's essentially God's words passed down to humanity, and we are meant to kind of live our lives based off of the morality that's kind of laid out in the book. And then another key tenet, which is the fifth bullet point, is spreading the gospel to save the world. So spreading the Christian message is a really key tenet in an effort to save other people, because if you don't convert, then you go to hell. So essentially, you could be the best, most perfect human, but if you don't convert, it doesn't matter, that you're gonna essentially suffer, and I think the next bullet point, fear of hell or eternal conscious torment, is really tied to that, a lot of times when people in these high control environments are pushing kind of these tenets, they're pushing it often not out of malice, but because they truly believe that this is a way to save people and help people not go to hell and help people to be better and to make better decisions. And so as a result, the kind of groupthink can become pretty strong around this. And then the next slide, or the next bullet, is purity, virginity, and abstinence culture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about purity culture in the slides after the break. And then altar calls, healings, and scary sermons can also be a pretty big part of, for folks who are experiencing religious trauma or have experienced religious trauma or adverse religious experience. Altar calls are essentially these very public declarations of kind of reaffirming your faith in front of your faith community, that often at the end of church services, there will be an altar call where the pastor will call people to either stand up or come to the front publicly to reaffirm their faith. In certain religious communities, no, that not all, but in certain religious communities, there can be public healings. And there can also be some pretty scary sermons about, what hell is or what it might mean if you go to hell. And I think especially for people who grew up in these types of environments, that can be a pretty scary experience to hear about. You might be kind of damned to eternal torment if you do something wrong or if you don't believe hard enough. And so for a lot of people I work with who are undergoing religious trauma or have experienced religious trauma, this is a piece that even after people have kind of cognitively left the spiritual experience or the faith community, that some of this fear and the guilt can linger. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. And then this next slide, the title is Manifestations of Religious Trauma. It's again on a beige background with the dark green oval shape on the right. And one major manifestation of religious trauma, and on the first bullet, is essentially difficulty forming one's own identity. That the church often presents such a complete and, quote, correct way of living life that often people steeped in this ideology don't really get a chance to figure out their own beliefs on their own. And doing so as an adult or without the supportive community or doing so alone can be a pretty immensely painful and confusing experience for people who are choosing to leave these types of communities, because questions are generally not accepted because they're kind of viewed as dangerous to the salvation of your soul. And so as a result, people start to see what are pretty normal desires and questions as kind of bad or wicked by default. And it can be pretty hard work to restore agency after being steeped in such a fear-ridden and punitive ideology for such a long time. There's also the totalitarian nature of religion, which is the second bullet point, that when we're talking about religious trauma, we're really talking about trauma in a broader sense because it affects how we view relationships, family, sex, existential questions, body image, shame, work ethic, rest, politics. Like, these belief systems really have a very far-reaching ripple effect on all these other areas of our life. And so I think for people who are leaving these types of communities, it can be kind of hard to disentangle because they're so pervasive and it's not always clear when you're within the community how they've affected you. So a lot of times people will leave the belief itself, but all the roots underneath are kind of left behind and are still impacting growth in other areas. And so frequently what I'll see when clients, come in for religious trauma is that clients often don't come in actually for religious trauma, that people will frequently come in for depression, anxiety, trauma, relationship issues, and then over time some of these religious beliefs and trauma or abuse or adverse experiences that have happened start to unfold as we continue to work together, but sometimes they can be pretty insidious or they can be pretty buried underneath. And then purity culture, guilt, and shame is the third bullet point on this list. And again, I'm going to talk about purity culture a little bit more in depth after the break. But when we think about guilt and shame, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about shame after the break, shame is a thing that can be learned. And, it has a lot of questions to do with what is power, who gets to wield power. And it can really foster an unhealthy relationship with our own bodies and our own sexuality and around shaming ourselves and others. And then finally, the last bullet point here is grief, where deconstructing or deconverting for a lot of people who are really ingrained in these communities, it often means losing your entire community and maybe also losing your worldview. So this could be your worldview of what is the meaning of life, what does the present mean, or even some of your afterlife beliefs. And this, I think, just on an existential level, can be pretty terrifying and pretty anxiety provoking for a lot of people. So when we think about religious trauma, it's often twofold. There's the trauma from the religion itself, from being in the high control space itself. And then there's the trauma from leaving the religion, which is its own trauma. And so I've talked a little bit about deconstruction. I want to talk a little bit more specifically about what it is. And so this slide has a beige background and some orange and green lines, and then the text is in a lighter beige box in the middle. And the title of this slide is Working with Clients Around Religious Deconstruction. And then there's a definition of deconstruction, which is the process of re-examining and pulling apart your belief system. So deconstruction, it's a pretty recently popularized term for essentially the reverse of indoctrination. I think I started to see it pop up around like 10 or 15 years ago. So it hasn't been around for too long, but it's essentially this, it's an emotional and psychological sense of re-examining and pulling apart everything that you've believed. And so as you can imagine, it can really result in a sense of loss of belonging because for all the high control aspects of a lot of these environments, they do provide kind of this very stable, very kind of coherent environment where you know what to do, you know the right things to do, even if they're not feeling like they're serving you, you know that if you do these things, you'll get certain consequences and you'll get certain results. And so when people leave this type of environment, just the lack of structure can feel pretty disorienting, especially at the beginning. So if we think about church, these types of church communities, often they do provide community, they provide a family. And sometimes if you leave, it is hard to find that type of deep belonging. And as someone myself who has left those sorts of communities, I do find that, that sort of belonging, it's a very specific form of belonging that even, years after I've left those communities myself, I don't think that I've experienced that sort of kind of deep connection with, around a shared belief system in the same way. And so as a result, there's a lot of grief and mourning, loss of community, loss of belief system, loss of moral compass. And for a lot of clients who are working around religious trauma, there's also loss of time where people can undergo a lot of grief around the time that they spent within the religious environment and grieving time that they didn't spend exploring other parts of their lives, potentially sexuality or gender, other parts of their identity or other parts of their communities. And so in the immediate aftermath of someone leaving these sorts of communities, we usually see an increase in anxiety and depression and trauma responses, especially as people are essentially trying to rebuild their entire worldview. So there is a profound sense of loss of all these things, but sometimes people will also feel like they themselves are lost. And this can manifest in a lot of different ways. Again, just because of the really far reaching and pervasive nature of religious doctrine. And so it affects afterlife beliefs, but it also affects, how we engage in friendships. Like, do we equate self-worth to work or to marriage? We talk about like work ethic, how much is work ethic kind of connected to their belief system and their spiritual belief system. And so the bullet points underneath this definition of deconstruction read that this is essentially the reverse of indoctrination. The meaning of this can differ from person to person. It's usually related to re-examining beliefs, actions, and relationships, and then also making meaning and understanding of past events and power dynamics. And then going to the next slide, this is again on a beige background with orange and green lines around the border, and then there's some text in a lighter beige box in the middle. And the title of this slide, it's again working with clients around religious deconstruction. And the first bullet reads, in some evangelical contexts, the process of deconstruction may be viewed as an attack on Christianity itself, and therefore something to be controlled or condemned. I've seen a lot of rhetoric in certain evangelical circles pop up on the internet recently around how deconstruction is synonymous with losing one's faith. And I think for some people, deconstruction for some people is the process of moving away from faith, but for some people, it's the process of redefining their faith. And deconstruction doesn't necessarily mean that someone has to move away from their faith, but they are kind of reevaluating their relationship to what faith and spirituality mean for them. And so some people do begin their deconstruction process after potentially going to something like therapy and maybe realizing that their anxiety has roots around their religious beliefs. Others also start when things like, their marriage or their relationships start to fall apart or start to struggle despite following really traditional beliefs on sexuality. Others might start to learn more about things like systemic racism and start to connect their experiences of this with experiences within the church. And some people, start to deconstruct because they start to recognize their own queerness and maybe cannot support the church calling them disordered or worse. And for some people, it's a combination of these things. And there are a lot of reasons that people choose to deconstruct. But essentially, and the second point reads, for some, this is the process of exploring what can be rebuilt and restored in their faith. And then for others, it might look like stepping away completely. And the final bullet point reads that frequently this happens in response to someone being personally harmed or witnessing harm to others by a religious institution. And then the next slide, again, is on the beige background with the orange and green lines around the corner, and then the text in the lighter beige box in the middle. And again, the title is Working with Clients Around Religious Deconstruction. And so, like we talked about, previously learned feelings, even after someone has cognitively rejected certain religious beliefs, may still show up. And so things like, continued guilt after rejecting beliefs about sin may persist, even after someone has kind of cognitively left behind the religious or spiritual tenets of their religion. And so the second bullet reads that deconstruction is also not the same as healing from or integrating religious trauma. Deconstruction is often a very cognitive process that I think for a lot of clients who are going through this process, they find extremely helpful, potentially even foundational, as they kind of make the choice to leave these environments. But this knowledge is not the same as understanding how some of those beliefs have been ingrained in one's mind and body, which is part of where therapy, I think, can be helpful and can come in. And then I also wanted to talk about the term spiritual bypassing, which is the third bullet point on this list. And this is a term that was created by a psychologist named John Wellwood in the 1980s to essentially describe the use of spirituality to bypass certain developmental needs or painful feelings or unresolved wounds. And it's essentially the use of spiritual practices to transcend or deny problems rather than understand them. And one thing to note is that for a lot of people who are undergoing this deconstruction process, spiritual bypassing can be a pretty common coping mechanism for people who are going through this process or who are experiencing religious trauma. That people who leave controlling religious spaces often find spirituality more broadly to be a more accepting and expansive area for exploration. And folks who are used to compartmentalization may also gravitate towards spiritual bypassing and its avoidance of difficulties. But this, as you can imagine, can lead to things like emotional numbing, detachment, fear, anger, maybe overemphasis on positives, and kind of some interpersonal difficulties if we are not kind of addressing some of the roots underneath some of these feelings. And there I think for a lot of people who come out of these high control spaces, a sense of embodied fundamentalism is often the reason that some people jump essentially from one fundamentalist system to another. And fundamentalism is a pattern of thinking and relating. It's the belief that a certain person or maybe a group of people know the right way to think, to act, to relate, or to believe and engage with the world. And that those who don't subscribe to that worldview are lesser than or dangerous or to be pitied or hard to relate to or just to be avoided altogether. So in terms of this, we see it in high control religious environments, but I also see this pattern in things like multi-level marketing schemes, certain wellness communities, social media, certain lifestyle groups, and also in certain cults. That these kind of elements are not always just relegated to these kind of high control Christian spaces, but they can also be embodied in other areas. And then, okay. We're kind of at the end of the first section, so I wanted to do just a little discussion and check-in. This slide is on a dark green background with some orange and green shapes, and the title of this is discussion and check-in. And then the first question is how much of this content was familiar to you prior to today? And then the second is if this is new to you, how will learning this change how you might work with clients who are experiencing religious trauma or have had adverse religious experiences? And so before we go into the break, we'll just take a couple of minutes if folks want to type into the chat or if you want to verbally share something, you can also go ahead and do that. Okay. And I see one question in the chat. Can you talk a little bit more about deconstruction is not the same as healing from or integrating religious trauma? Yes, great question. So deconstruction is a very cognitive process. So it's essentially the cognitive process of kind of unindoctrinating yourself. So it's a very cognitive and intellectual process around essentially why your belief system might not hold up anymore. Whereas healing from religious trauma or integrating these experiences does require, at some level, like an integration of the experiences that happen in the body, which I imagine a lot of us here work with trauma. We know that, trauma gets stored in the body and coded in the body in a lot of different ways, and religious trauma is no different. And so we can't think our way out of trauma. So deconstruction is very focused on the thinking and the cognitive part, which I think, can be really helpful for clients, just to give words and to give kind of a structure and a framework for why they might be leaving these environments. But kind of the work of integrating these things at the level of our bodies or at the level of integrating some of these feelings and, how they want to move forward, even thinking about like reestablishing worldviews around spirituality or things like afterlife. Those things are not always addressed by deconstruction. And, a lot of comments. I'm just reading some of these, looking out for questions. Great. So I am aware of the time and I want to give folks some time for a break. So I know it says 10 minutes, but just because I feel like with this, I'm always running out of time with this particular training. So if we could actually do 5 minutes, that would be great. And I'll stick around here if anyone wants to ask any questions. I'll just be here. But yeah, for those who want to take a bio break, get up, stretch, get some water, get some tea. Let's come back at 11:03 and I'll see you all then. Hey, hi everyone, welcome back. Okay. I am gonna go ahead and get started. And one note, I feel I always try to shove so much information into this training, and it could probably pretty easily be longer or even in two parts. And so I just want to say I realized that this is like a lot of information to cover within 2 hours, and we're kind of like speeding through a lot. And this is a pretty broad overview. And so, yeah, like if we have any questions, hopefully there'll be some time at the end to kind of do a bit more Q&A. But welcome back, everyone. And so this next slide, it's again on a beige background. There's a pink oval in one of the corners, and the title of this slide is Purity Culture. And so this is a concept that I think for especially, a lot of people who have kind of had some interaction with these types of high control Christian environments, especially purity culture. You've probably heard the term purity culture. And the first bullet reads that this is essentially the concept that chastity or, quote, sexual purity is a measure of a person's worth. The second bullet reads, there's a quote in the second bullet, and it reads, it's a systemic set of ideologies enforced by religious communities through educational programming and events that place the brunt of sexual responsibility on young men and women. And so this is it's an idea that gained popularity in the 1990s. It's pretty heavily connected to the rise of evangelical Christianity. And it's also connected to a culture of modesty that might be prevalent in other religions too. And this is an idea that unfortunately can really exacerbate concepts like monogamy, or not monogamy, misogyny, or racism, or rape culture. And it can really impact how people see themselves. And this concept alone, I think, can really create systems of internalized and externalized oppression and shame and judgment that can really serve to restrict sexual agency. Another piece of purity culture, and we're on the next slide now, and the title is again Purity Culture. It's again on a beige background with a pink oval in the corner. And the first bullet reads that purity culture exists within the gender binary, that within this idea of purity culture, especially within the context of a lot of these high control environments, people who are socialized with women are taught that their sexuality should be bottled up and to essentially feel at fault if someone shows any sort of romantic or sexual interest in them. So people who are socialized with women are essentially taught that they are responsible themselves for averting the male gaze, and that if they receive any sort of unsolicited attention, it's their fault. And then on the flip side of that, people who are socialized as men are taught that sexuality essentially cannot be tamed and that they need to do everything in their power not to let their sex drive get out of control. So for certain men within these sorts of high control spaces, this might include, avoiding even looking at women or being in a space alone for any amount of time with someone that they perceive as a woman. And as you can imagine, it create, if we think back to sort of that behavior control aspect and the thought control aspect, this pairs really well with purity culture. And then the other piece of purity culture too is that a lot of, and this is the second bullet point on this slide, a lot of studies about purity culture most often focus on the heterosexual cisgender female experience of purity culture. But there are also a lot of young queer people who internalize the gender binary and homophobia that are so inherent to purity culture who are also harmed. That people who are within the queer community tend to be hypersexualized anyway, regardless of their level of sexual activity. And purity culture really places the spotlight on people's sexual activity and what they can and can't do, and how they should present themselves, and what is the right way to present or the wrong way to present, and anything outside of that being deemed as wrong or sinful. And as you can imagine, can really do a number on things like self-worth, body image, for people who are outside the gender binary, doing kind of increasing things like gender dysphoria, difficulty with kind of coming to terms with sexuality or gender identity if they're not within this binary. And then alongside this, and this is the last bullet point on this slide, BIPOC people, I think, can also really be harmed by this internalizing of white Eurocentric standards of beauty, relationality, and also gender. And so purity culture, it really presents this very rigid way that you have to exist within the gender binary and you have to interact with other people within this binary. And then on this next slide, I just wanted to do a little reflection, and you can feel free to type into chat if you want. But the bullet points on here read, what are some of the implications that this might have on things like mental health, shame, gender and sexual identity? And then what connections do you see between purity culture and colonialism? And I saw someone just type in the chat about Jen Hatmaker. I love Jen Hatmaker. So thank you for that resource. So I think like through this frame, I saw someone type, this is some white Victorian control BS for sure. Agreed. So I think through this frame, it kind of becomes pretty clear how purity culture, which essentially seeks to control the way that we're in relationship to our bodies, has really deep roots in patriarchy, white supremacy, and even capitalism, all fruit of the tree of colonialism as an overarching umbrella. Because purity culture calls us to essentially be ashamed of having bodies and having bodies that do all the things that bodies do and all the normal functions that come with having a body. It tells us to essentially hold our natural desires suspect and to discard them because they're sinful. So for a lot of queer and trans folks, it calls us to be ashamed of our sexual and gender identities, especially if we don't conform to dominant kind of cisgender and heteronormative standards. For BIPOC people, again, it really calls us to conform to white Eurocentric standards. That's a benchmark. So I kind of see this connection as systems of power have a stake in us continuing to hate ourselves. And so in this way, it's kind of, when we're working with people who are choosing to love themselves and embrace their identities outside of this, that in and of itself, I think can really be an act of resistance. And to me, like, that's really a piece of how these two things are really connected. I'm just gonna, I know that a lot of people are have been typing things into the chat, and I really appreciate all the interaction. And I know that I'm trying to read everything, and also just with lecturing, I won't be able to read everything, but I want to read the last few ones. Someone wrote feelings of responsibility that would impact shame and impact everything around having bodies. Yep. I think it makes it really challenging to begin to think for or trust our own instincts after leaving religious environments. We're actively taught not to trust ourselves and our instincts. Yep, absolutely. And I think those elements also really connect, purity culture and colonialism, and I think they're all kind of fruit from the same tree in that way. And then moving on to the next slide, this is again on a beige background. There's kind of a dark green brushstroke in the corner and a lighter green brushstroke right under the title, and the title is Manifestations of Shame. And so I want to talk about a different, because sometimes we talk about shame in this very monolithic way. And I think when we're working with religious trauma, it can be helpful to kind of break down shame into a few different types of shame. And so the first bullet point here is developmental shame. And the bullet reads, these are experiences of shame that are part of human bonding and attachments. And in this context of secure attachment, shame can be transitory. So if we think about shame developmentally, shame is at its core a reflexive body response to a perceived social construct. So there are some experiences of shame that are inevitable because the affect of shame is really the flip side of human bonding and forming attachments. So if we think of gaining acceptance from a community as we gain a sense of belonging, we gain secure attachments. When an expected or anticipated form of connection is blocked, then shame occurs. So shame in this sense can really help to regulate social behavior through the discomfort of disconnection. And developmentally, some theorists suggest that this type of shame is established even before language is established, like as early as 18 months. And so shame in this way, if it happens in the context of a secure attachment, it's unpleasant, but the pain is pretty transitory and it's not wounding in lasting ways if you have these other secure attachments that are kind of bolstering you. But it's in the context of insecure attachment or chronic shame that I think for a lot of young bodies, especially within these environments, can really be shaped into developing a sense of self that's rooted in pretty deeply wounding patterns, which then becomes a vicious cycle. So if we think about dispositional shame, which is the second item on this slide, and the bullet underneath reads, this is shame that becomes someone's internalized way of navigating the world. And so this is where shame essentially becomes someone's habitual way of navigating the world. It can feel pretty violating to the self, and it can also harm our ability to cultivate values that support healthy relationships or support taking action to move toward healthy relationships. And so this is where the foundation of shame essentially obstructs someone from perceiving their own depth or listening to their own depth or to their own inner truth. And if in its most severe outcome, especially within these sorts of high control religious environments, the only knowledge of the self is permitted. The only knowledge of self permitted in shame is knowledge that kind of conforms to the religious authority, which may establish truth that it may or may not actually align with who you believe yourself to be or who you feel yourself to be. And in these cases, and we're going on to the next slide now, which again, the title is Manifestations of Shame, and it's on the same beige background with the same dark green brushstroke in the corner and the brushstroke right underneath the title. And this slide addresses chronic shame and religious trauma. And chronic shame, I think, is one of the most insidious parts of the shame that can happen in these types of high control Christian environments, because it's routinely presented and constantly presented and kind of justified as love. So this type of shame, it kind of helps to shape communities by being, kind of advocating for shame as an appropriate means of developing ourselves. And so the first bullet point on here reads that this is shame that shapes bodies, again, into developing a sense of self that is rooted in deeply rooted wounding patterns. And then this can really result in even things like shame about feeling ashamed. And historically, Christian teaching has advocated for shame as an appropriate means of developing ourselves. So this is like believing that shame will help our loved ones and ourselves to conform to God's will and spend eternity in heaven. And so this shame is often justified as love or affection or care. And this can create this sense of like an ontological wrongness of identity, like the wrongness of the self as ourselves, like the wrongness of like our identity as it exists without any other context. And so I think this can really shape the ways that our bodies experience shame. And if we think about trauma as being coded in the body, there's this visceral knowledge, this like physical reflex of acting before the mind even has time to suggest or consider alternatives. And when shame really gets in the way of that, it can really affect I think, how people live the rest of their lives, including how they might, explore communities outside of these high control communities or develop kind of, moral frameworks or existential frameworks or afterlife or spiritual frameworks outside of the ones that they've kind of been given automatically. And then moving on to the next slide, this slide is titled The Impact of Shame, and it's the same beige background with the dark green brushstroke in the corner. So the first two bullet points read, growing up believing that you're born sinful and difficulty forming your own identity. So if you kind of are raised in this environment or are indoctrinated into this environment where essentially your very identity, your very existence in some way is wrong and you need someone else to save you, as you can imagine, this can make it really difficult to foster a sense of self-worth. And for some people who, are raised within these sorts of environments, when they leave these environments, there can be this sense of like development being hindered in some way, because for better for worse, like in a lot of these kind of high control environments, you're handed the answers without really having to figure it out for yourself. So there's not really an opportunity for discovery. So when people leave these environments, all of a sudden it's like there's so many options for, how to live your life, how you can identify, how you can, approach your values and, what this means about, even things like afterlife. It can feel really overwhelming to kind of form your own identity in this way. And also because questions are not generally accepted. And for a lot of people who are leaving, and the third bullet point on here kind of gets at this idea that the cognitive idea of being free and being able to live however one wants can sound liberating, but the lived experience of this immediately after leaving a religion can feel really destabilizing and disarming. So we can think about this through a trauma lens too, that, if we think about like a nervous system being really used to being activated, and when it's finally at rest, that in and of itself can feel really destabilizing. because our nervous systems are not used to to being at rest. And so in this way, for people, when they finally leave these sorts of environments and they have like all this freedom to live the life they want, I think, working with clients around how to create some sort of structure around that can often be helpful, kind of taking things step by step and breaking things down into smaller steps. Because, as we talked about, and this is the last bullet point on this slide, as we talked about right before the break, humans do thrive on things that seem familiar, and fundamentalism does provide this very specific, orderly and binary and prescriptive way of kind of engaging with life. And this is the reason that for a lot of people who are leaving these environments, they can kind of have a propensity toward kind of gravitating toward other fundamentalist environments, even if they're not religious. Because, for a lot of people who are leaving these sorts of environments, they're looking for structure, or we're gravitating towards structure in the same way. And then moving on to the next slide, which is also titled The Impact of Shame. It's the same beige background with the dark green brushstroke in the corner. And the first bullet point on here is about how shame can prohibit entire categories of emotions. And the experience of shame, I think, to me, really lies at the core of religious trauma, because having prohibitions around entire categories of emotion, as we can imagine, can contribute to a lot of psychological difficulties, including depression, anxiety, guilt, sometimes even substance abuse. And cognitively, too, especially for people who are going through this deconstruction process, there can be some difficulties engaging with things like free association, fantasy, creative thought, or problem solving, especially if folks are not really used to being able to do that. And then this experience of shame, there's something called the doctrine of total depravity that's also pretty core to certain parts of high control evangelical environments, which essentially teaches that every aspect of human nature is corrupted, that people cannot do anything spiritually good on their own. And so if you're raised in an environment that essentially teaches you that you're born bad, and you are all bad, and all your natural inclinations and all your behaviors, this of course has an impact on kind of your sense of self-worth and your sense of agency. And I remember there was one sermon that I sat through, this was years and years ago, where they actually said a baby is a viper in a diaper, where essentially, like when you're born, like you have no control over like the badness of who you are, and you just kind of have to accept it. And then you have to accept being saved by someone else, where you have no agency on your own to affect any change in terms of your identity. And so, we can think about like, even if someone has cognitively distanced themselves from something like this, a lot of the deep-rooted shame and guilt that might be at the bottom of that around like self-worth and agency, I think those things do tend to linger and have more of a ripple effect, even after people kind of cognitively go through the deconstruction process. And then one thing to note too, which is the final bullet point on this slide, is that the formation of shame, I think, is not always incompatible with the sincerity of religious belief or feeling loved by those dispensing those teachings, which I think, can also make it really challenging for people to leave or to make the decision to leave. Because often for people who are within these communities, like I think it's a really important piece to understand that even the people who are dispensing this type of shame, they're doing so because they believe it will help their loved ones kind of conform to God's will and go to heaven. And so for a lot of, dynamics within families, within these religious communities, sometimes they're frequently structured around chronic shame while denying systemic shame at kind of an individual or a systemic level. And so when we talk about like spiritual bypassing, that can often happen in these environments as well. And so I think, in the same ways that I think people in general have trouble leaving abusive environments, this can have a lot of parallels with that, religious communities may be the only place that someone has experienced that sort of close-knit community. Or, I think one thing that churches sometimes aren't good at doing, even if there is a lot of shame kind of at the core, are things like community care. When someone gets sick, they will bring you food. When that sometimes like in certain church communities, despite all this shame, like people do show up for each other. And so when we think about leaving these communities or being kind of cut off from these communities, it also means kind of losing all of that. And that can be, as you can imagine, really challenging for people who are leaving. And then moving on to the next slide, it's again a beige background with a pink oval in the corner. And this slide is titled The Impact of Oppressive and Systemic Institutions. So up until this point, we've been exploring the impact of religious trauma on a pretty individual and relational level. So now I want to zoom out to a more institutional, systemic, and cultural level, especially because we're talking about exploring how to work with religious trauma, especially around QTBIPOC communities. So I think a really big part of trauma-informed learning is contextualizing experiences. So if we think about religious trauma zoomed out on a cultural level, I think the context of, Christian colonization, both historical and also current, it's pretty undeniable. Like, we don't have time to fully delve into this history today, but I think it's pretty important to understand that religious trauma, especially for QTBIPOC folks, it happens within this historical context, that Christian colonization has extended its arms into virtually most of the ancestry of all BIPOC people. And this history is pretty accessible online if you're interested in doing some of your own reading. But Christian missionaries were essentially a really large arm of European imperialist powers, and Christian colonizers often used faith as a justification for genocide and for slavery and for exploitation of resources. And so with that in mind, I wanted to talk about this idea of coloniality, which is the first definition on this slide. It's a complex process that also involves colonizing the psychological and social worlds of the colonial subjects. And so this might include, people like original inhabitants of certain geographic areas, but also those who come after, who are kind of subjugated by the colonizer's sociopolitical system. So when we think about religious trauma, especially in the context of Christianity, I think it's pretty important to think about it also through this historical context. And there are a few key constructs of coloniality, which are listed also on this slide. The first one is that creation must be improved. So this is where human nature is kind of viewed as inherently deficient. There's the idea of original sin, where anything outside of anything governed by reason is viewed less than, and all else can be exploited or objectified. So within this view, I think it's pretty easy to condone harsh punishments or hierarchy as necessary to keep people in line, especially people who are viewed as inferior by those in power. The second construct is that the individual self is central. And I think, when we think about even, within our fields, like the predominance of the self in mental health is pretty prominent. And so this is where the self is viewed as responsible for all success or all failure. So in this view, it kind of follows that self-oriented behaviors would take priority over behaviors that focus on the collective or on social responsibility. The next key construct is that life is compartmentalized. So in the colonial worldview, every individual is viewed as a detached entity with distinct boundaries. This is unlike an Indigenous worldview, which considers everything to be connected and interdependent with each other. And then the next one is that ownership is possible and desirable. So in this view, ownership leads to happiness. The idea of ownership goes along with the orientation to self and individualism. It kind of emphasizes materialism and finding happiness there. And it emphasizes individual liberty over social responsibility. The next key construct is that time is bounded, where time is construed as one-dimensional and linear with distinct boundaries between past, present, and future, which I think for, when we think about it in the context of colonialism, makes it pretty easy to ignore the future consequences of today's actions because they're not here yet. So if the goal of colonization was to seize and conquer with immediate positive consequences for those who colonize, then there are immediate negative outcomes for those who become colonized. And then finally, the last key construct is that existence is hierarchical, that if we believe that creation must be improved, then hierarchy pretty easily emerges from there. And then this next slide, the title is also Impact of Oppressive and Systemic Institutions. And I think we can still see kind of the far-reaching impact of colonization in many high-control religious environments right now, and it's kind of inherent in a lot of the individual and interpersonal traumas that we've been talking about. And I think when we're working with QTBIPOC folks, one major way that this can manifest is through the form of generational trauma and also internalized oppression. So generational trauma, it's the first definition on this slide. It's experiencing oppression over multiple generations, sometimes over multiple lifetimes. And this can lead individuals to internalize messages of inferiority that they receive about their own group membership. Generational trauma usually begins from a really young age. Over time, it can even become this very unconscious, involuntary response to oppression, in which members of the group internalize negative stereotypes. So if anyone has done any research around like stereotype threat and the way it shows up in testing environments, that is a really kind of real-time kind of example of how this can have an impact on QTBIPOC communities. And then the second definition here is internalized oppression, which is the process by which oppressed groups come to internalize and adopt the negative views and stereotypes transmitted by the oppressive majority. And this is often the result of both external oppression and exploitation. I think QTBIPOC people are particularly susceptible to this within high control religious environments, because high control religious environments tend to kind of champion this very kind of gender binary, kind of very rigid way of being in the world that often upholds, things like patriarchy and things like misogyny, especially within these types of high control environments, as a way of controlling the people within it. And so for people who have intersections that might be kind of historically or systemically oppressed or disadvantaged, I think, for people who already don't fit into that mold just because of who they are, they can be particularly susceptible to a lot of this internalized oppression, which can then lead to a lot of, the other forms of shame that we've talked about at a more intense level. And this type of systemic oppression, and this is the final bullet on this slide, it can happen at different levels. It can happen at the level of the personal and the relational and the institutional. So if we take a more like ecological or community model to this and apply it here, I think we can really easily see it play out in these sorts of high control environments. And then the next slide is titled Working with Clients Around Moving Forward. And so, like we talked about before, a lot of clients don't seek out therapy for religious trauma specifically, but rather they present with difficulties in like interpersonal or emotional or cognitive realms. And religious trauma, I think, can also share a lot of symptoms with complex trauma or PTSD. And so often like the effects of traumatic religious experiences are often uncovered over time through the course of therapy, rather than someone kind of presenting to therapy saying that they, that they want to work on religious trauma. Some people do. And I think as religious trauma becomes more known in the mainstream or, more learned about, like I do have some people who are now coming in saying that they want to work on religious trauma, but especially in the last decade, I think, a lot of this work around religious trauma was usually not the presenting issue and kind of became more of the presenting issue over time. And I think when we're working, with clients around how to move forward, it can be helpful to kind of conceptualize religious abuse as a form of betrayal trauma. And this is the first bullet point on this slide, which reads that religious abuse is a form of betrayal trauma in which the people or institutions on which a person depends for survival significantly violates that person's trust or well-being. So experiences of trauma, betrayal, or confusion, I think really have the potential to take on like a larger, more overarching meaning when it's attached to something that feels really sacred, like your faith, for example. So for people who, believe in God, harm done to them in the name of God or by a representative of God, you can imagine carries enormous weight and power. And people who might have previously found meaning in their spiritual beliefs or comfort in their religious beliefs may face an existential crisis or a crisis of faith due to the use of the sacred as integrated in the abuse. And I think for QTBIPOC people in particular, this can also be, and this is the next bullet on this slide, for QTBIPOC people in particular, this can be a particularly destabilizing experiences if religious communities are their main source of support or their primary cultural community. And so to give an example from my own experience, like when I first entered into this type of community, it was through the context of a Chinese church. And it really, I think it was one of the first times that I felt really accepted by people who looked like me. It was like this very interesting cultural hub where people in a lot of ways really showed up for each other. Like they gave free meals to people. You could, connect with people intergenerationally. And there was a lot of comfort in that. And then paired with, all the other stuff, like all the, the isolation from, people who are outside of the in-group, like the shame as a means of driving behavior, all these things to, like shutting down of various parts of identity. All these things are all lumped in together. And so, and it's that I don't love this phrase, but people use this phrase like, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sometimes it can feel a little bit like throwing the baby out with the bathwater when people leave these communities, because they're also leaving behind, all these other sources of community. And especially for QTBIPOC people, if they attended like a culturally specific church, that can be a really huge loss, just depending on where they live and can they forge that community in other ways and in other places. And I think church really gives like this very structured way of doing that, where I think it is very possible to forge those communities outside of church, but you do kind of have to build it up yourself, kind of piece by piece. And I think, losing the comfort of kind of having all of that presented to you in a structure that already exists can be really hard, and that can be a really huge form of grief for people who are leaving these communities. And so the next bullet reads spiritual crisis or crisis of faith, which we talked a little bit about, when people have used, when kind of the like things that people considered to be sacred have been integrated into abuse or harm, that can create like a crisis of faith, and people kind of having to redetermine what faith means to them, or what their relationship is to faith, and how they want to reconstruct that. And so when I'm working with clients around moving forward, especially from this form of betrayal trauma, I think the importance of choice becomes really paramount. And this is the final bullet on this slide, where in religious systems, often there's someone else who's prescribing life choices for you. So they're prescribing, what you can do, who you are, what you can believe, how to dress, how to act, who you can interact with. And so if someone has never really had the opportunity to make their own choices, often the only choice is to do the exact opposite of what they've previously done. And for, I think, a lot of people who are leaving these sorts of environments, that can be just something to keep in mind, that, I think true choice involves thought, intention, and curiosity, and allowing yourself to make a decision that's most in line with who you are and what you value. And for people who are coming out of these environments, they might not know. So even asking the question, like, what do you want? A lot of people have trouble answering the question of what they want, because they might never have been in a space where they were allowed to want anything that was outside of what the group had prescribed. And so I think a lot of the work that we can do with our clients is around, kind of getting to know your own values. What does meaning mean to you? Like, what is your identity? Like that, even that, the idea that in and of itself can be a living document. And you get to change your mind. Like sometimes, like you can know those things cognitively, but to know those things at the level of your body can take some time. And I think we see this too in other forms of trauma, not just religious trauma. And this could also mean, like, for some people, they might want to kind of maintain or kind of reclaim certain aspects of their faith or of their spirituality. And so I've moved on to the next slide, and the slide is it's titled Working with Clients Who Wish to Maintain Spirituality. And it's again on the beige background with the dark green brushstroke in the corner. And the first piece too around this is grief and loss. And that's the first bullet point on here, that I think deconstruction and then also reconstruction of your belief system is an ongoing process. It's a lot of work up front. And sometimes things come up later in life, depending on relationships or seasons of life or certain triggers. But this doesn't mean that someone hasn't healed. It just might mean that their body's ready to release another layer of the trauma and abuse that they've endured. So I kind of look at reconstruction as an ongoing process of grieving. So I think we can be aware of, I think, just our very human tendency to live in stages of denial as a coping mechanism. And I think as humans, we all do this. So helping our clients to look for areas where they've engaged in denial and potentially gently bringing some light to it. And then also using a definition of denial from a trauma-informed lens, where denial is a defense mechanism that used to keep us from seeing how things truly are. Because if we did see how things truly are, they would feel just intolerable at some level. So I think when I'm working with folks who are leaving these sorts of environments, I like to do a lot of work around kind of looking at denial, not as the same as being gullible or being duped. Like, no one is stupid for having kind of stayed in this type of environment, but rather having people have compassion and kindness to themselves when their tendency might be to engage in a shame spiral because they didn't see something or they feel they should have known better. So again, there's a lot of overlap here in working with survivors of abuse at large, with working with survivors of religious abuse or religious trauma. That affirming and mirroring compassion back to someone, I think, will help them increase patience with themselves, and then also celebrate that they were able to identify something new that they hadn't been able to identify before. So doing a lot of work to re-examine values, and that's the second bullet point on here, reaffirming that all emotions have permission to show up, realizing that something new coming up doesn't mean that you're taking a step backwards, and also realizing that coming to a place of acceptance around all this, it's a lifelong, usually daily process, with not necessarily being glad that things happen, but just recognizing kind of why things are the way they are and feeling that what needs to be felt in the moment. And for some people, they may want to hold on to elements of their faith or to be a part of their church or to join maybe a different denomination or new religion altogether. For other people, they may reject all faith teachings and just want to live a life outside of faith or any religious systems. And I think it can be important to work with clients around having this choice that, just because you're leaving one environment, were there things that served you? Were there things that gave gifts to you that might be worth holding onto? And maybe yes, maybe no, and they get to have a choice around that. And I think it can be tricky too with maintaining, when this is the final bullet on here, people who wish to maintain relationships with people who are still within the abusive religious system. And I think this can be, there can be a lot of overlap here with people exiting other sorts of abusive environments where, it might be a family member, it might be your friend, or it might be someone connected to your work where maybe, for whatever reason, you're not able to cut off contact completely. Or I think for some people within certain cultural systems, like, I'm Chinese, Singaporean, American, and like family is a really like collective family belonging is a really important concept. And so when I'm working, with a lot of Asian American clients, for example, kind of cutting off people who were behaving abusive to you may be an option, but it also may not be an option. So I think working with clients around what feels accessible to them, and if they are going to distance themselves from certain communities, and they kind of, can they seek that connection or those forms of, cultural connection even in other places so that they're not losing everything completely. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about integrating a liberatory lens, and that's the title of this next slide. And this slide talks about liberation psychology. It's on a beige background with some dark green, pink, and orange shapes scattered around the edges. And I truly believe that individual well-being is really inseparable from collective and community well-being. And I find that integrating a liberation psychology lens and working with QTBIPOC clients, especially those who have experienced religious trauma, can provide a really good framework for this. And what I like about liberation psychology is that it really serves to remove the blame of distress solely from the individual and their immediate circumstances, and it reframes distress as like an environment and social structure under which people might have been subjugated. So the first bullet point on here reads that liberation psychology aims to actively understand the psychology of oppressed communities by conceptually and practically addressing the oppressive sociopolitical structures in which they exist. And the second bullet is that the individual is inseparable from the sociopolitical, and recognition of the inseparability of the two is liberating to both. And then the final bullet is that it reframes and it removes and reframes blame. And I really like this approach because it doesn't regard client distress as an internal flaw, and I think in therapy, this type of approach also provides an opportunity to kind of demystify a lot of the discomfort that people in marginalized groups or people in historically excluded groups normally experience. And it can also pave the way for curiosity, I think, for further explorations about, how have we maybe even inadvertently participated in dynamics that didn't serve us, and then how to deal with these alienating circumstances more constructively. If we can put it in context, I think it can help clients, especially for clients who are really prone toward shame, maybe because of the religious environment in which they were raised, kind of expanding one's view outside of just that you did something wrong to let's look at how the context and the environment has really shaped what you believe and your interactions and relationships with other people, I think can be kind of a kind way and a very, to me, a really helpful way of approaching some of these topics. And going on to the next slide, I really like this view, and the title of this is Integrating a Liberatory Lens. It's on the same beige background with the dark green, pink, and orange shapes all around the corners. I like this lens because it does aim to be anti-oppressive. It states that all knowledge is socially and politically constructed and multiple, fluid, and intersectional, and that the purpose of therapy is to change people so that they can change the world, not just to change people and have it stop there. And I also like this lens because it honors the experiences of the oppressed, and it emphasizes clients' resilience and resistance while also addressing accommodation and potential complicity with oppression. And I think it can be a really helpful lens for addressing everything more holistically. And then ultimately, it also recognizes the effects of colonization and kind of bringing that context back into the room. And then this is the final slide of content. And the title is not recovery, but instead a new creation. It's again on the same beige background with the dark green, pink, and orange shapes around the corners. And I like to end on this because I really like Marcia Mount-Stroop, who talks about, the way that trauma can be embodied in, especially, in terms of religious trauma. And I like that she kind of conceptualizes this as a process of making something new in place of what has been lost. So rather than, kind of replacing something that's been lost, I think for a lot of people who are exiting these sorts of communities or considering exiting these types of high control communities, like the grief and the loss can be a pretty significant aspect of, their kind of journey and moving forward. So exploring what it might mean to make something new, knowing that, some of these losses might not ever be able to be replaced, but how can they make meaning of, what happens moving forward? And this entails openness to movement and prompting of the spirit arising within oneself. It's not primarily intellectual, but rather about felt experience in the body. And then I'm going to end with reading this quote, that the truth of embodied trauma is that safety evaporates as a familiar sensation, but trust and openness do not have to disappear. They can be cultivated, they can be relearned, but the body must be the primal site of learning. These are not simply ideas, they are visceral sensations that require cellular address. And I find this to be true when working with trauma at large, but especially with working with religious trauma, where all these other aspects of belief are also impacted. And then the final slide here is a resource slide. And this is not an exhaustive slide. I've listed some books, podcasts, Instagram accounts here. So as far as books, I do like the book When Religion Hurts by Laura Anderson. There's also a book called Empty the Pews, Stories of Leaving the Church, and it's edited by Chrissy Stroop and Lauren O'Neill. And then an older one is called Leaving the Fold by Marlene Winnell. And I really like the podcast Reclaiming My Theology. I like the Instagram accounts, Queer Sunday, Liberated Together, Your Favorite Heretics. A lot of these podcasts and accounts are kind of constructed around this deconversion process and deconstruction process. And I think for a lot of people going through this process, these accounts can be pretty validating as far as their own experiences. For therapist directories and further learning, I really like Reclamation Collective. So for Reclamation Collective, it's a therapist directory of therapists who work with religious trauma. And I also like that they have a lot of support groups. They have a lot of CEs. And they have these online support groups that I'm pretty sure are free to attend. I think there's one for therapists actually who have also been through religious trauma and are now working with religious trauma. I think there's a BIPOC one. I think there's a queer group. So for clients who might be looking for more of a community around having a space to talk through some of these experiences with like-minded others, I think that can be a really good resource. And then the Religious Trauma Institute was created by Laura Anderson. And I think, the last I looked, they were putting out a lot of research, and I know she just recently released her book in the last couple of years, but they do a lot of CEs and they do a lot of, kind of workshops and trainings around religious trauma. And so if you're interested in learning a bit more, I think that can also be a pretty good resource. And then if anyone knows of any other resources, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I don't think this is at all an exhaustive list, but yeah, if anyone knows of anything else, please feel free to share. Okay, and we just have a few minutes left, and I know there's some like housekeeping that OPA has to do at the end. So before we dive into that, maybe we can, if anyone has any last questions, feel free to ask them here. And this discussion and check-in, it asks the questions, have you worked with clients undergoing the deconstruction process? What themes did you notice? And how might the experience of shame show up in the therapeutic container when working with clients around religious trauma? And how might you hold a client's experience of shame and create room for this? So feel free to drop your thoughts there, or if you have any other thoughts, please feel free to either say them verbally out loud or drop them in the chat. And I see some, yeah, I'm gonna send the updated slides after this is done. I had like edited the slides this morning to make some changes. So yeah, I will send the updated ones after this. Okay.
Great, and I'll just jump in here really quick if anybody has to hop out for a client appointment or another meeting. The CE verification code for today's webinar is GLOW, GLOW. I'll also type that in the chat right now. So please watch out for your emails. You will get a survey this afternoon. And again, that survey must be completed by October 9th with that CE verification code GLOW. And I'll leave the rest of this space for any questions here.
I just saw someone drop a resource in the chat, Religious Refugees by Mark Harris. Thanks, Susan.
And there were a couple questions that came in throughout the chat, so I'll ask them. I'm not sure if they were fully answered or not, so you can let me know. As an IFS therapist, I am curious if there are common parts, managers or exiles that show up with religious trauma other than the obvious ones driven by guilt, shame, control, etc.
So I'm not an IFS therapist, but from my understanding of IFS, I think absolutely yes. I think people who are IFS therapists could probably speak to this more succinctly than I could. But I mean, I think I'm going to go ahead and say yes. I think in terms of working with shame, and especially around, I think religion and spirituality is such like a deeply held part of ourselves that I think it's almost impossible for these parts not to show up when we're working on something like deconstruction, or working on like how have these elements of shame impacted us. So yeah, sorry, I don't know if that answers the question, but I hope that's helpful.
Great. And another question that came through the chat was, without knowing any background on the new creation treatment idea, I am stuck on the echoes of Christianity within this very idea. New creation, felt experience, and spirit arising all ring of Christian concepts to me. Is this intentional? To what extent might this be helpful or harmful?
Yeah, I think when I put that on there, I was thinking of, clients who wish to kind of reclaim aspects. But I think, as far as language, including the language of this training, I think use what feels helpful to you, don't use what doesn't feel helpful to you. And I think for clients who are undergoing this process, I will often work with clients around what language they wish to use. And, also kind of if there's language that feels triggering or activating or not helpful, I think we can work around finding new language. But I think for those folks who kind of, look at it from more of like a reclamation piece, and especially people who might want to reclaim parts of themselves that feel like they want to integrate more spirituality, but in a way that feels more aligned with them, maybe that language can be helpful. But, I think don't use that language if it doesn't feel helpful for your client. And I see a hand raised. Stephen Payne. Hi.
Hi there. Yeah, I really appreciated that idea of reclaiming and in working with many of my clients who have had religious trauma, one of the very ways that I do it is in that kind of embodied way, particularly those people who have come from liturgical traditions,
Mhm,
and the body is so involved in the act of worship and so ingrained that to work with it invariably means creating new ritual. So it's
mhm,
it's like it's like it really I really resonated with that idea of new creation,
mhm,
except it's also empowering because they're creating
mhm. Exactly.
and
Exactly.
not having it created upon them or conforming. And it's a very powerful embodied way to address that trauma.
Mm, yeah. Thank you. I
Yeah,
appreciate that
absolutely.
perspective. Yeah. I like that they are creating
Hmm.
instead of having something created upon them.
Yeah.
I'm gonna file that one away for my clients too. Thank you. Okay. How are we doing on time? We have a few more minutes. Any other? I know that there were so many things coming through the chat throughout the last couple of hours that I know I've missed probably most of what came in because I have trouble kind of looking at the chat while lecturing. I see another hand raised. Hank?
Yeah, I'd just like to raise the suggestion that the notion that the only people who have faith are people who have faith in the supernatural is an unfortunate way to use that term. There are plenty of people who have faith in natural phenomenon, and they're no less faithful than those who put their faith in things that are supernatural.
Yeah, sure. I agree.
So it would be useful to stop referring to people of faith as meaning only those who believe in the supernatural.
Thanks, Hank, for the note.
And I
Any
have
other questions?
Melissa here in the chat asked if you could repeat your definition or description of shame.
Yes. Gosh. Okay. I just closed it up. Let me go back in. Like, what did I say about shame? So which part of shame? I know that that can be a, I talked about shame in terms of different manifestations of shame around developmental shame, dispositional shame, and chronic shame. And so was there like a specific piece of shame?
Nothing was
Oh, yeah,
specified. Oh, go
I
ahead.
see. Okay. So a body, yep. So when talking about developmental shame, it's a reflexive bodily response to a perceived social construct. You're welcome.
Another question was from Liz. I'd also be curious about approaches for folks who don't know what they want. Obviously, reconnection to the body and values defined can be helpful, but do you have any other tips?
Yeah, I think sometimes I go back to the five senses, honestly, with when I'm working with clients who don't really know what they want, whether, in the context of leaving religious spaces or just more generally that, working with like what's getting in the way of that. So are there deep rooted beliefs that kind of get like what's their relationship to knowing more about themselves or even being able to want things? And then sometimes I will go back to the five senses, just kind of these most, kind of basic bodily constructs of what do you notice in your body? What do you notice in your five senses? And how do they feel to you? Which I think, when I'm working with folks around trauma, kind of in general, kind of when I feel a little stuck, I think that's usually where I go back to is to the body. I hope that helps. Okay. Well, I know that there were so many other really thoughtful comments in here, and I'm really sorry that I am not able to address each one. But yeah, I'm gonna stick around for a few minutes after this. And I will send the updated slides to Taylor, and then I think she can send them out to you. And yeah, just thank you so much, everyone, for being such an amazing group and for asking such great questions and for all the interaction. And I hope you all have a good day. And I put my email on here, and just in case anyone wants to get in touch.